Fellas, we're back in the UK this week for UFC Fight Night London. The UFC always deliver when they go to the UK. I know the Manchester pay-per-view last year was kind of underwhelming, but at least the fight nights that we keep having in London always seem to deliver. So, of course, I'm going to be breaking down every fighter on this card as well as my own personal predictions. And we'll go straight in there with the first fight. Guram Kutateladze versus Kaue Fernandes. Guram Kutateladze had a pretty solid start to his MMA career, a lot of stoppages. Ended up training with Chimaev and joining Chimaev's camp. Actually ended up beating Mateusz Gamrot in his UFC debut. Then went on a 2-fight losing streak, a close loss to Ismagulov, got knocked out by Elvis Brady, but in his most recent fight picked up a win over Jordan Vucenic, who's also on this card on a short notice fight. Then he's going to be taking on Kaue Fernandes, who also had a pretty solid start to his MMA career from Shooter Brazil. Lost his LFA debut, went 2-0 in his next 2 fights in LFA. Lost his UFC debut to Mark Jacquesi, but picked up a win in his most recent fight by stoppage against Muhammad Yahya. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go Guram Kutateladze by TKO in the 3rd round. It's either going to be a decision, in my opinion, or TKO to Guram Kutateladze. Kaue Fernandes, coming off a good finish over Muhammad Yahya, but Muhammad Yahya isn't the highest caliber UFC fighter. And we just saw with Jordan Vucenic, who's a talented fighter, debuting against Guram Kutateladze in the UFC isn't the easiest thing to do. And we've seen Kaue Fernandes get out-wrestled by Mark Jacquesi. I know Jacquesi's not a terrible wrestler. He's not a terrible wrestler, but he's also not the highest level as well. And he kind of got dominated by Mark Jacquesi. And Guram, in my opinion, is a way better wrestler than Mark Jacquesi. Way better attributes, much better striker too. I think he's going to work Kaue Fernandes on the feet too. So I think Guram Kutateladze is going to overwhelm Kaue Fernandes. There's going to be too much to deal with on the feet. Going to land the bigger shots, the better shots. But I think the big impact from Guram Kutateladze in this fight is going to be the takedowns. Taking down Kaue Fernandes, dominating with the grappling, dropping him, piecing him up on the feet, lighting him up. And just kind of overwhelming Kaue Fernandes, who I'm still not as entirely convinced he is UFC worthy. Losing to Mark Jacquesi, win over a low-level fighter in Muhammad Yahya. Now he's facing Guram Kutateladze, who's, become a bit more active. Fought last October against Jordan Vucenic, and now is coming in with a full training camp dedicated to Kaue Fernandes. I'm going to go Guram Kutateladze, and I'm picking him to win by ground and pound finish in the 3rd round against Kaue Fernandes. And now we have Ireland versus England. Caolan Loughran versus Nathan Fletcher. Now, these guys have actually fought before on the amateur scene where Nathan Fletcher ended up beating Caolan Loughran after 3 rounds by unanimous decision. So this isn't the first time they've ever competed. They fought in the amateur space. Caolan Loughran had a very, very good start to his MMA career, in his professional career. Ended up having a vast majority of his wins and then by stoppage became a Cage Warriors champion. And so far, he's 1-2 in the UFC. Lost to Taylor Lapilus and Jake Hadley. Picked up a win over Pacheco, but he did lose last time in the UK against Jake Hadley. Going to be taking on Nathan Fletcher, who also had a very solid start to his MMA career. Went on a complete running Cage Warriors with the vast majority of his wins by submission. Ended up losing to Woodin by a stoppage at some point, but then picked up another 2-fight winning streak in Cage Warriors. Lost his UFC, well, not his UFC debut, but lost on the Ultimate Fighter to Carnofley, but ended up getting a stoppage in his UFC debut after he was just gifted an immediate contract in his most recent fight. In terms of who I'm picking to win, this is a tough one to pick because Caolan Loughran's fairly talented. He is low level, but he can do a bit of everything. He's a pretty solid wrestler. His boxing is kind of crisp. Nathan Fletcher did lose on the Ultimate Fighter, but he did come through on his UFC debut. He's obviously a very good submission artist in Nathan Fletcher who can do kind of the bare minimum on the feet, but I still think he's a bit more dynamic than Caolan Loughran. I'm going to go with Nathan Fletcher to win this one by decision. He's from a good gym as well. I'm pretty sure he's training out of Next Generation Liverpool, who, by the way, absolutely despise Caolan Loughran. But no, I've been kind of bought on the hype of Nathan Fletcher. I know he lost on the Ultimate Fighter to Carnofley, but his jiu-jitsu is definitely far superior to Caolan Loughran. I think from a striking perspective, unless Caolan Loughran can get in on the pocket and start striking with Nathan Fletcher, landing the body shots and landing the combinations, I think it will be Nathan Fletcher using his range to pick apart Caolan Loughran, occasionally trying to mix it up to the ground. I'm not sure if there's going to be much ground in this fight because, again, I know Nathan Fletcher comes from a BJJ background, but Caolan Loughran's wrestling isn't bad. But I'm going to go with Nathan Fletcher to win this one, and I'm picking him to win this one by decision, just like the first time when they fought on the amateur scene, because like I said, this isn't the first time we've seen them fight. Then we've got Shauna Bannon versus Puja Tomar. Shauna Bannon came from Taekwondo. She competed in some Taekwondo tournaments. Nothing like crazy like the Olympics, but she has been competing in a lot of Taekwondo. That is her background. Started off her amateur career as well. Pretty successful, actually. Ended up losing to Dakota Ditchever at one point, who's now one of the best women MMA fighters in the world. Started off her MMA professional career, going pretty solid, becoming a champion in the local scene. Lost to Bruna Brazil, who's a Fighting Nerds fighter, in her UFC debut, but picked up a win over Alice Ardeline, but with a close decision in her most recent fight. She's going to be taking on Puja Tomar, who's the first female Indian fighter in UFC history. Started off her MMA career going 3-1 with nothing but stoppages. Went over to 1FC, didn't go the best, ended up getting basically destroyed in 1FC. Went back to the regional scene, picked up 4 wins, all by stoppage, becoming a champion in the local scene, and picked up a controversial win in her UFC debut by decision. Another one that's not easy to pick because as good as Shauna Bannon is on the feet, she hasn't been looking absolutely astonishing. Like, she lost to Bruna Brazil. I know Bruna Brazil's kind of talented on the feet. And then she had a close fight with Alice Ardeline, who's awful. And now she's going to be taking on Puja Tomar, who had a close fight herself. I'm going to go with Shauna Bannon, though, by decision. I think she definitely... I mean, she's obviously more experienced in the UFC. I think the loss to Bruna Brazil hasn't necessarily aged badly because Bruna Brazil isn't a terrible striker. She's having competitive strikers with other good strikers in the UFC. You know, finished Molly McCann, had a close fight with... Well, didn't have a close fight, but put up a fight with Wang Kong as well. Puja Tomar, not entirely sure she's UFC worthy. When she went over to ONE FC, she got destroyed, and her win over Amanda was very controversial too. So I think it is going to be another very close decision win where Shauna Bannon just kind of picks apart Puja Tomar on the feet, does the better with the kickboxing. She has no power, the Shauna Bannon. She ain't getting a stoppage, but I'm going to pick her to win by decision in this fight. Then we have Andrey Pulaev debuting in the UFC against Christian Leroy Duncan. Andrey Pulaev had a pretty solid start to his MMA career. The vast majority of his fights being by stoppage, was a bit of a prospect, comes over to the Contender Series, gets the decision win on the Contender Series, and this is going to be his UFC debut against Christian Leroy Duncan, who also had a very solid start to his MMA career, had a massive run in Cage Warriors, becoming a Cage Warriors champion, defending the Cage Warriors belt too. Got a finish in his UFC debut against Tybura, bit of an injury, but he still got the finish. Lost to Armand Petrosian, then went on a 2-fight finishing streak where he dominated Dennis Tululin and Claudio Ribeiro, but lost his most recent fight by decision to Gregory Rodriguez. I'm going to go with Christian Leroy Duncan to take home in the second round. I know there's a little bit of hype of Andrey Pulaev, you know, this guy who's coming from the regional scene, won in the Contender Series, but debuting in the UFC against Christian Leroy Duncan is a tough debut. I mean, you look at the losses that Christian Leroy Duncan has suffered. Armand Petrosian isn't that bad of a striker. I know he's just been cut from the UFC, but he's not that bad. Gregory Rodriguez was a massive prospect, and apart from that, he's been dominating people as Christian Leroy Duncan. Really good striking, powerful guy on the feet too is Christian Leroy Duncan. Very durable. His grappling is very high level. Like I said, absolutely dominated Ribeiro with the grappling. And I just think Andrey Pulaev, it's going to be a bit of a handful in his UFC debut. I see Christian Leroy Duncan making it a competitive fight on the feet, but eventually making the fight or taking the fight to the mat, taking down Andrey Pulaev, who has been kind of standing in the majority of his fights, and eventually getting a ground and pound stoppage, maybe even a submission. But I think he's going to maul them in the same way that he mauled Ribeiro. I'm not against Andrey Pulaev. He hasn't been looking bad, but to debut in the UFC against Christian Leroy Duncan, I know there's people saying that Duncan is kind of a failed prospect, but he's lost to Gregory Rodriguez. You know what I mean? Gregory Rodriguez is still one of the best unranked middleweights in the world, despite losing to Cannonier. So I'm going to go Christian Leroy Duncan. I'm picking him to win by stoppage, and I think second round TKO via ground and pound via mauling is probably the most likely outcome. So I'm going to go Christian Leroy Duncan. Then we have Marcin Tybura versus Mick Parkin, a heavyweight ranked fight. I've been looking forward to this fight, man. You've obviously got Marcin Tybura, who's a veteran of the sport. He's been competing for ages, had a massive start to his MMA career. The vast majority of his wins by stoppage. Became a local champion on M1, which is quite big down there in Poland. Started off his UFC career going 3-1, losing his debut, but then went on a 3-fight winning streak. Had a bit of a tough spot where he went 1-4 in his next 5 fights from 2017 to 2019. And then he ended up going on a bit of a tear, winning, I think, 7 out of his next 8 fights, only losing a decision to Volkov, and apart from that, just beating people. And then in his last 4, he's been knocked out by the best, Tom Aspinall, submitted Tata Wivaza, lost to Sergey Spivak in a fight night main event, and then just absolutely battered Denise in his most recent fight. I think it was UFC 309. And then you've got Mick Parkin, who started off his MMA career pretty good as well, with nothing but stoppages. He also went over to Tom Aspinall's camp. He is training with Tom Aspinall with that heavyweight crew, which is probably the best heavyweight gym in the world. Got a finish on the Contender Series, went 3-0 in the UFC, wins over Kyle Machado, Jamal Pogs, and Mohamed Usman. And then in his most recent fight, knocked out Lucas Brzezinski in the first round at UFC London. This is a tough one to call. I know there's a lot of people behind the hype of Mick Parkin, but I'm going to go with Marcin Tybura, the veteran, to win this one. I'm going to go with Marcin Tybura. I think for Mick Parkin, I just don't really see him having a massive key to victory in this fight. If he keeps the fight standing with Marcin Tybura, it's not like Tybura's a bad grappler. He likes to make it ugly. I can see him kind of showing a lot of issues to Mick Parkin in the clinch, you know, roughing him up in the clinch, and I think he is going to try to take the fight to the mat, just like he did against Denise, and work Mick Parkin on the ground. Now, I know Mick Parkin's ground game is a lot better than Denise's ground game, and he's not as bad as Tuivasa necessarily, but I don't see Mick Parkin knocking out Marcin Tybura. I know he just knocked out Brzezinski, but Brzezinski's one of the worst heavyweights on the roster, and Tybura's an absolute veteran of the sport. So I'm going to go with Marcin Tybura to meet Mick Parkin. It's not even like Mick Parkin's looked amazing in all 4 of his fights. He had a very close fight with Mohamed Usman. His fight with Jamal Pogs was quite close as well. His only real dominant fight has been his win over Lucas Brzeski, and now you're throwing him in there with Marcin Tybura, who's a veteran of the sport, and he's one of the best top 10 gatekeepers. I wouldn't be surprised if Mick Parkin can pull it through by some sort of decision, but I think Marcin Tybura is going to mix up with the grappling, work Mick Parkin with the ground game, not necessarily demolish him like he did with Denise, but I just think Marcin Tybura is a little bit too well-rounded, too experienced, and has been at the highest level for the longest time. As much as I want Mick Parkin to win, this is a big step up in competition to go from Lucas Brzeski to Mick Parkin to Marcin Tybura, so I'm going to go with Marcin Tybura to win. I think he gets this one done by decision because of the work that he's going to do in the grappling and the way that he mixes the striking up with the grappling, and I'm also questioning the discipline of Mick Parkin. You can see him outside of training camp, very out of shape. I don't know if he's completely dedicated to being a top heavyweight, so I'm going to go Marcin Tybura. Then we've got one of flyweight's biggest prospects, Lonnie Kavanagh versus Felipe dos Santos. Lonnie Kavanagh, he had a big amateur, well, no, I didn't really have a big amateur career, but started off his MMA career obviously as an amateur, actually debuted at 13 years old. His first MMA fight was at 13. Started off his professional career with a very successful start on Cage Warriors, having a bit of a run there. Debuted on the Contender Series, getting a stoppage, and then recently got a win at UFC McCann after he looked really impressive. He's going to be going against Felipe dos Santos, who also had a successful start to his MMA career. Debuted in the UFC against Manel Cap on short notice, and even though he lost that fight, he lost it by decision, didn't look too bad against Manel Cap, ended up winning in his next fight against Altamirano, but lost his last fight against one of flyweight's biggest prospects in Andrey Lima. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go with Lonnie Kavanagh. This isn't just the fact that I'm not sure Felipe dos Santos is the highest caliber flyweight. I mean, losing to Manel Cap, fair enough, and losing to Andrey Lima, fair enough. I do think he is UFC caliber, but he's definitely not ranking potentially, in my opinion, is Felipe dos Santos. But Lonnie Kavanagh might be flyweight's biggest prospect right now. He looks rapid on the feet. He's this big prospect, undefeated as a professional, came from Cage Warriors, looked really good in the Contender Series. He's got pop in his hands as well. He's a good grappler, quick on the feet. I just think he completely outclasses Felipe dos Santos, pieces him apart on the feet with the speed of Lonnie Kavanagh. I think the striking is completely different. Felipe dos Santos, he looked good against Altamirano, but even that was a close fight too. And I just don't know if he's ranked worthy, whereas Lonnie Kavanagh, I can see him becoming one of these flyweights, like a Joshua Bannon, like an Andrey Lima, who could potentially make it to the top 10 of the flyweight division. So Lonnie Kavanagh, I'm picking him to win this one by decision, unanimous decision. Very, very good prospect in the flyweight division. Looks very promising, and I think he's going to go far in this division. Lonnie Kavanagh by decision. Then we've got Jai Herbert versus Chris Padilla. Jai Herbert started off his MMA career very well. Ended up losing to Reese McKee, who ended up being in the UFC, but apart from that, it was just pure wins. Ended up going over to Cage Warriors, becoming a Cage Warriors champion, defending it as well. Loses in the UFC in his UFC debut against Francisco Trinaldo, and then also gets mauled by Renato Marcano. Then he gets a win over Karma Worthy. Then he gets put against Ilia Topuria, and he actually nearly knocks out Ilia Topuria with a head kick, which would have been crazy, but eventually he got put to sleep brutally by Ilia Topuria, and since then he's been 1-1-1, beat Kyle Nelson, drew with Ludovic Klein, and lost to Fares Ziam. And he is coming off a win though to Rolando Bedoya in his most recent fight at UFC. I think it was at Abu Dhabi last year. He's going against Chris Padilla, who had a very good start to his MMA career, becoming a champion on the local scene. Then he kind of fell off a little bit in his MMA career, started losing a bunch of fights, went on a 3-fight finishing streak, became a champion on the local scene. Then since the UFC debut, he's gone 2-0 with 2 submission victories, or 2 victories in his UFC first 2 UFC fights. It's a tough one to call, but I'm going to go with Chris Padilla via TKO in the 3rd round, and I think it's going to be because of his grappling. Chris Padilla does seem to be a really promising grappler in the UFC. The way that he manhandled James Lontop, absolutely destroyed Rongsu. That injury was kind of gruesome, and he does look like a really good grappler, does Chris Padilla. I know Jai Herbert comes from a team with good takedown defense, and you look at Jai Herbert's record, to some of his losses, I mean, drawing to Ludovic Klein, losing to Fares Ziam, losing to Ilia Topuria Moicano. These aren't bad losses, but I just don't know about Jai Herbert. He's coming off that win over Bedoya that was quite close, and that was on short notice. If it stays on the feet and Jai Herbert can keep it on the feet, I've got full confidence that Jai Herbert will win this one by decision. But I'm bought on the hype of Chris Padilla with his grappling. He's looked good in the UFC so far. It doesn't seem like too big of a step up for Chris Padilla too. I think he's going to work Jai Herbert in the clinch, make it a bit of a boring fight, make it ugly. But eventually I think he's going to wear him out and get that TKO via ground and pound. So I'm going to go Chris Padilla to win this one by TKO via ground and pound, take him down to the mat and work him with the grappling. It is a tough fight to call. I wouldn't recommend betting money on this fight because Jai Herbert, like I said, he's lost to good fighters. He's beaten some pretty, not any major bad names. He comes from a team with good takedown defense, but I'm going to go Chris Padilla to win this one by TKO in the 3rd round. Then we've got Nathaniel Wood versus Morgan Charriere, and massive English featherweight prospect, a massive French featherweight prospect. England versus France. You've got Nathaniel Wood. He had a good start to his MMA career, losing a couple of times, but was on an upward trajectory. Ended up going to Bellator at some point, went over to Cage Warriors, went on a bit of a tear in Cage Warriors with 4 finishes, became a Cage Warriors champion, debuts in the UFC, gets a stoppage, followed up by another stoppage, followed up by another stoppage, ends up losing at some point to John Dodson, who was obviously this massive flyweight name at one point, and then after that goes 1-1 in his next 2 fights, and since then, his career has been on an upward trajectory, 5 fights, 5 decisions, did lose to Mohamed Naimov, but that was a very kind of, it was a bit of a cheated fight where he got fouled 5 times and they didn't deduct Mohamed Naimov from a single point. He's also been competing in a bit of grappling with the likes of Alex Caceres too, so he's been working on his grappling a bit. He's going to be taking on Morgan Charriere, who had a pretty bad start to his MMA career, losing a lot of fights, kind of was a journeyman outside of the UFC, not really doing much. Eventually comes over to Cage Warriors after beating, he also beat William Gomez on the regional scene, but eventually goes over to Cage Warriors, becomes a Cage Warriors champion. He also notably lost on Cage Warriors to Jordan Vucenic, who's on this card, and also Paul Hughes, who obviously is one of the biggest names outside of the UFC. And since then, after that, goes on a 3-fight winning streak in Cage Warriors. Then after that, joins the UFC, and since then in the UFC, he's been 2-1 with his only loss being to Chepe Mariscal, who's obviously a really good featherweight prospect. And he is coming off a knockout win over Gabriel Miranda at UFC Paris. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go the prospect Nathaniel Wood to win this one by decision. It's a tough one because Morgan Charriere is dangerous, and I feel like his record doesn't display how good he is. He is a very dangerous striker. I just think Nathaniel Wood's very well rounded. You can tell within the training and the quality of opponents in the grappling that the grappling of Nathaniel Wood has definitely been improving, and I think that's going to be his key to victory. Mixing it with the grappling against Morgan Charriere, putting on the pressure, and I'm still really bought on Nathaniel Wood. I still think he's got what it takes to become ranked. He's beat some good names. Andrey File, Charles Jourdain, recently roughed up Daniel Pineda, nearly finished him. If it weren't for the submission threat of Daniel Pineda, he probably would have got a ground and pound TKO. Morgan Charriere 2-1 in the UFC. I'm not sure if he's on the same level as Nathaniel Wood, and I'm just bought on the hype of Nathaniel Wood. Like I said, even his loss to Mohamed Naimov, he was cheated massively in that fight. So I'm going to go with Nathaniel Wood in the UK to win this one against Morgan Charriere by decision. It is a very close fight on the feet because of the danger that Morgan Charriere does present, but I think Nathaniel Wood's too experienced in the UFC, too well-rounded. He's going to use that veteran experience to get this one done. I'm going Nathaniel Wood to win this one via decision. Then we've got Jordan Vucenic versus Chris Duncan, England versus Scotland. Jordan Vucenic had a pretty average start to his MMA career, and then after that, just went on a massive run in Cage Warriors. From 2019 to 2024, it was just nothing but Cage Warriors. Ended up losing to Paul Hughes at one point, like we discussed earlier. Also beat Paul Hughes before Morgan Charriere on the regional scene. And then on 1 week's notice, takes on Guram Kutateladze, which is a tough fight to debut against, and actually put up a decent performance against Guram Kutateladze. Dropped him at one point. He did end up losing the fight, but it was a close fight. And then he's going against Chris Duncan. Started off his MMA career with 3 wins. Eventually joins Bellator, goes on a 4-fight winning streak, or not all of them were in Bellator, but gets 3 finishes in Bellator, loses on the Contender Series to Borshev by knockout, gets 1 win on the regional scene, comes back to the Contender Series against Charlie Campbell, gets a knockout victory, and then since then, well, after that, he goes on a 2-fight win streak in the UFC, gets choked out by Manuel Torres in Mexico, and then in his most recent fight, submitted Balazs Yoke at UFC, I think it was Abu Dhabi last year, or it might have been UFC Paris, but he is coming off a submission win. I'm going to go with Jordan Vucenic to win this one by submission in the second round. Jordan Vucenic, I think, is a really good lightweight prospect. I mean, the performance that he put against Guram Kutateladze on short notice in his debut was very impressive because Guram Kutateladze is a really talented flyweight. And in terms of Chris Duncan, he hasn't really beaten any high-level lightweights yet. He lost to Manuel Torres by submission, and Torres isn't particularly known for his submission game. He beat Balazs Yoke, who's low level. He beats Yanal Asmus, who's low level. And I think Jordan Vucenic's going to bring the game in this one. I think the striking out of the two of them is very close. Vucenic can strike, Chris Duncan can box too. I think it's going to be competitive, but I think the jiu-jitsu of Jordan Vucenic, the grappling game that he does bring, is going to pose some problems to Chris Duncan, who we've seen deal with grappling problems before. And Jordan Vucenic has got really good jiu-jitsu. He showed it on Cage Warriors. Even against Guram Kutateladze, he was able to take down Guram Kutateladze at some point in their fight. So I'm going to go Jordan Vucenic. I think he gets the submission within the distance. Second round submission for Jordan Vucenic. But again, it could be a 5-fight. It is a tough fight to pick because Chris Duncan, he has kind of impressed me, especially with his most recent win over Balazs Yoke. But either way, I'm going to go Jordan Vucenic by sub in the second round. Then we've got a short notice fight. McCann versus Alexia Thainara. Molly McCann's in for a real big... this is a much tougher fight for Molly McCann than the original scheduled opponent that she originally had. Obviously, Molly McCann had a pretty solid start to her MMA career, like everyone, became a champion on Cage Warriors. Lost her UFC debut, then went on a 3-fight winning streak, and she actually became the first British woman to win in the UFC. Lost her next 2 fights after that, then went on another 3-fight winning streak where she kind of made a name for herself, getting a spinning elbow against Loughran and Caolan, which actually was one of the best knockouts in women MMA history. Actually was one of the best knockouts of the year for 2022. And then she gets the exact same finish against Hannah Goldie in her next fight in London. She's got 2 massive knockouts, but since then, she has not looked impressive at all. She's lost 3 of her next 4 fights, lost to Erin Blackfield, and then lost to some really low-level fighters. And she has been competing in grappling. She's been winning in grappling. So she's definitely been working on it, but it hasn't really been shown in the octagon. Going to be taking on Alexia Thainara, who has had a massive career outside of the UFC. Actually ended up losing also to Bruno Brazil outside of the UFC. And she also got 2 submissions in 8 seconds via armbar, so she seems to have a bit of a decent submission game herself. Became a champion on the local scene and recently is coming off a win by decision on the Contender Series. You just can't trust Molly McCann in the UFC. As much as I want to go with Molly McCann to use her experience to win this one, you cannot trust her. I'm going to go with Alexia Thainara to win this one. Not only has Molly McCann been preparing for a much easier opponent than Thainara with a completely different style. If you look at Thainara's game, it generally does seem to be grappling. I know in the Contender Series she kind of stored her striking, but it did tend to be majority of her work being grappling, her submission game, and that's the last thing you want against Molly McCann. She took on Julia Storyolenko not long ago, who isn't that good of a grappler, and she got submitted in the first round when that was supposed to be a free win. She got pieced up and nearly finished by Bruno Brazil. As much as I want to go with Molly McCann, I just cannot trust her. I'm going to go with Thainara, who's coming from the Contender Series, who's 11-1, looked impressive on the regional scene to at some point in the distance deal with work Molly McCann with the grappling. I don't know if she's able to pull off a submission, but I think the grappling of Thainara is going to pose some threats to Molly McCann. We've seen Molly McCann get dominated via grappling too many times. I know she's, been competing in grappling tournaments and whatever, but I'm going to go with Thainara. I just cannot pick Molly McCann. I cannot trust Molly McCann to win. So I'm going to go with Alexia Thainara by decision. Talking of fighters that you cannot trust in the UFC, you've got Kevin Holland against Gunnar Nelson, the return of Gunnar Nelson. Now, an insane statistic about this fight. Since 2019, Gunnar Nelson has fought 2 times in the UFC. Kevin Holland has fought 23 times. So the inactivity difference and the activity difference between the two of them is absolutely crazy, where Kevin Holland has been significantly more active than Gunnar Nelson. But obviously, a quick rundown on Kevin Holland. Had a big career outside the UFC. Went over to Bellator, got a finish on Bellator, won on the Contender Series. Ended up going 3-2 in his next fights in the UFC, losing to Thiago Santos and Brendan Allen. And then had a massive year in 2020 with 5 straight wins in one single year, 4 stoppages, finishing Anthony Hernandez and Joaquin Buckley back-to-back as well. But since then, he's been in a bit of a win-loss fighter. He hasn't really been able to put a winning streak together. He's now lost 4 of his last 5 fights. And he seems to kind of just be a journeyman in the UFC who showed up for a paycheck against Gunnar Nelson, who was a Renzo Gracie black belt, came from a massive grappling background where he was competing in grappling tournaments, specifically jiu-jitsu tournaments. Had a good start to his MMA career with a massive winning streak, goes on a 4-fight winning streak in the UFC, and since then he's kind of been a bit of a win-loss fighter, but has been getting a lot of submissions in his UFC career, with a vast majority of his wins. 74% of his finishes in his MMA career have been via submission, or just 74% of his wins. I know that you can't really trust Kevin Holland, and we're putting him against a grappler in Gunnar Nelson, but I don't think Gunnar Nelson is on the same level as necessarily Reina Derrida. I know this is a very risky pick, but I'm going to go with Kevin Holland to win this one by knockout. I'm hoping that Kevin Holland has kind of understood that at this point in your UFC career, you have to win. This isn't not just slouch, go up and show for a paycheck, because if Kevin Holland loses this fight, he's putting his UFC career genuinely on at threat, because he's probably getting paid a shit ton of money. If he keeps losing, nobody's going to, want to sign him back to the UFC. And on top of that as well, Gunnar Nelson has been insanely inactive. He has not been inactive at all. Like I said, 2 fights since 2019 compared to Kevin Holland's 19 fights. Holland's been fighting much higher level fighters. The last low level fighter that he fought in, Mikhail Alexia, he ended up getting a finish against. I think Kevin Holland keeps this fight standing, and eventually within the distance is going to knock out Gunnar Nelson. He's getting quite up there in age now. Like I said, very inactive is Gunnar Nelson. I'm picking Kevin Holland to knock him out in the first round because it is Kevin Holland. He is very dangerous on the feet. I know you can't trust Kevin Holland, especially against grapplers, but but I just don't know how much I want to pick Gunnar Nelson, who's been so inactive, who's getting up there in age, coming back to the UFC against Kevin Holland, who even though has, you know, he isn't the most consistent. You look at Kevin Holland, it isn't even like he's fighting lower level fighters. I mean, he's facing Rene Derrida, who's ranked. Roman Dolidze coming off a great win, top 10 fighter. MVP, amazing striker. JDM, amazing striker, fighting for a belt. So it isn't like Kevin Holland's losing to bums. And Gunnar Nelson just hasn't been beating the highest level opponents too. So I'm going to go Kevin Holland by knockout. I think the reach, the striking threat that Kevin Holland brings is going to pose a threat to Gunnar Nelson. And I'm hoping that there's going to be a bit more urgency for Kevin Holland to win now. So I'm going to go Kevin Holland by KO in the first round. Hopefully he gets this one done, but you can never be too sure with Kevin Holland. He's not the most trustworthy fighter. Then we have the co-main event, Jan Blachowicz versus Carlos Ulberg. Jan Blachowicz had a massive career outside the UFC, fighting in KSW, becoming a KSW champion. Comes over to the UFC, gets a win and a finish in his UFC debut. Then he goes 1-4 in his next 5 fights. Actually started contemplating retirement after 2017. And then after that, kind of just shakes up the light heavyweight division. Obviously ends up becoming a champion by knocking out Dominic Reyes when Reyes had a shit ton of hype. Beats Adesanya when Adesanya moved up in a massive super fight. Lost to Glover Teixeira, lost his belt to Glover Teixeira. Then he beat Alexander Rakic when Rakic injured himself. And then ended up fighting for the belt again against Ankalaev, going to a draw with Ankalaev, which I thought he should have lost. And then in his most recent fight, which is a year and a half ago, lost to Alex Pereira. He's going to be taking on Carlos Ulberg, who actually came from a modeling background. Carlos Ulberg has a background of modeling, which is obviously what he came from. And then he got into kickboxing after modeling, went to a kickboxing career, then pretty much immediately went over to Dana White's Contender Series, got a finish on the Contender Series, got finished by Kennedy Nezakuku. Then after that, he went on a bit of a big tear, and he's on a huge winning streak now with the vast majority of his wins by knockout. So he is a bit of a finishing machine, even though he's coming off a decision of a Volkan Oezdemir. I'm going to go with Carlos Ulberg to win this one. I know Jan Blachowicz has been facing nothing but top fighters. He's a former champion. It's Polish power. He nearly beat Pereira. You know, it is what it is. It might be a fraud checking and whatever, but I don't know how I feel about picking Jan Blachowicz in this fight. Carlos Ulberg is a very dangerous guy. He just beat Volkan Oezdemir in fairly impressive fashion, and Oezdemir is a very similar fighter to Jan Blachowicz in terms of styles. And Jan Blachowicz, let's just take this into perspective. He hasn't fought for a year and a half. He's coming off 2 shoulder surgeries. His last legitimate win, if you take away the injury win over Rakic, was all the way back in 2021 when he defeated Israel Adesanya. He shouldn't have beaten Ankalaev. He didn't beat Alex Pereira. He got submitted by Glover Teixeira. He's 42 years old, coming off surgery, and he's inactive. And you want me to pick him over this active, fresh prospect who just beat Volkan Oezdemir in impressive fashion in Carlos Ulberg? I'm going to go with Carlos Ulberg to win. I'm sorry, I've got to go Ulberg to win this one by decision. I know it's going to be a close fight. It is going to be an easy fight. It's going to be a stand-up fight where they kind of fire back and forth. Maybe Jan Blachowicz, if he's smart, is going to try and take the fight to the mat, but I think it's going to be easier said than done. I think Carlos Ulberg knows that's going to be the game plan of Jan Blachowicz as well. We could even see a finish in this fight from Carlos Ulberg because he is a very dangerous fighter. Previous to the Oezdemir fight, he was on a streak of nothing but finishes. I'm going to go with Carlos Ulberg by decision. I think he is the new age of the light heavyweight division. Jan Blachowicz, he's been out for too long. He's coming off surgery. He hasn't won a legitimate fight since Adesanya, a middleweight, back in 2021. So I'm picking Ulberg to win this one by decision. I think the era of Jan Blachowicz is long past us by. It would be good to see Jan Blachowicz get back in the winning column. He's one of my favourite light heavyweights, and he could honestly pose a threat to the champions because of how he's performed against them in the past. But I'm going to go Carlos Ulberg by decision. That is what my brain is telling me. Carlos Ulberg gets this one done. He's been a lot more active, like I've discussed. I'm going to pick Ulberg to win this one. Keeps the fight standing, picks apart Jan Blachowicz, does the better on the feet, and picks him by decision. And then we've got the main event. Leon Edwards returning after a dominating defeat against Sean Brady. Another short notice fight, not too short notice. It was, it's on about a month's notice, so it's not that short notice. You also got Sean Brady, who came from the local scene, became a champion on the local organisation, actually ended up beating somebody called Rocky Edwards in the past, which is quite fitting. Comes over to the UFC on this big winning streak with a couple of submissions, eventually runs into Belal Muhammad, the current champion, gets finished on the feet by Belal Muhammad, somehow got finished by Belal, and then since then he got a submission win over Kelvin Gastelum and fought in the main event against Gilbert Burns and beat Gilbert Burns by basically outstriking him and mixing up with the grappling. Going to be taking it against Leon Edwards, who had a good start to his MMA career, became a champion on the local scene, lost his UFC debut, picked together 2 wins, including one of the fastest knockouts in UFC history, lost to Usman the first time, and then he goes on this massive tear, and the rest of his career is kind of history. Knocked out Kamaru Usman in one of the biggest knockout wins and becomes a champion in the welterweight division, which is obviously what he's known for. anymore. In his most recent fight, got dominated by Belal Muhammad, and he is coming back with vengeance. Now, I feel bad for Leon because all he's been facing is grapplers. Usman grappler, Covington grappler, Muhammad grappler, and now he's facing another heavy grappler in Sean Brady. I bet he was so chuffed to fight JDM, and now that this is on short notice against another grappler, it's a tough one to call. I would not count out Sean Brady in this fight. I've been hearing a lot of interviews from Sean Brady. He seems to have completely locked in his training now. Submitting a guy in Kelvin Gastelum, out-striking and out-grappling Gilbert Burns as well was quite impressive. We know that Leon doesn't necessarily do terrible against grapplers, and he has got a decent takedown defense base, but maybe Sean Brady's seen the blueprint to beating Leon Edwards after watching his fight with Belal Muhammad. If Sean Brady can push the pace on Leon Edwards for 5 rounds and potentially even find a submission in there, he's definitely got the capability to do that. Like I said, his only loss is to Belal Muhammad, who Leon Edwards is lost to as well, so it is a tough fight. I'm expecting Leon Edwards to pull this through by decision. I'm going to go with Leon by decision. I'm expecting his takedown defense and his preparation against grapplers to be much better since his work with Belal Muhammad. I'm expecting him and his team to have improved his grappling, his takedown defense a lot more. And on the feet, as good as Sean Brady might have been, I can't pick a guy who's getting finished on the feet by Belal Muhammad to beat Leon Edwards, unfortunately. So I'm going to pick Leon Edwards to outpoint Sean Brady in a fairly close fight. I see this going very similar to the Covington fight, in my opinion. Maybe a bit closer than the Covington fight, where Sean Brady has his moments with the grappling, can potentially take Leon Edwards down, but Leon gets right back up and gets back to work on the feet, outpointing Sean Brady. And it wasn't like Leon had no moments against Belal Muhammad. You know, I think it was the 4th and the 5th round when he actually took down Belal Muhammad, was firing down elbows, cut open Belal. So it isn't like Leon's a bad grappler. He was able to take down Covington and Usman too, so by no means am I calling Leon a bad grappler. I just trust Sean Brady, I just trust Leon Edwards in this fight, that he's worked on his issues. He's, you know, coming against Sean Brady with a much better version of himself. I'm picking Leon Edwards to win this one by decision. But those are my predictions for UFC London. Let me know your thoughts, if you agree with the predictions, if you have any other takes, if you have any other picks. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.